The recent rebasing of the gross domestic product of Nigeria now includes pension fund administrators, drawing attention to the sector's economic significance. Now, reviewed at a workshop by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group and the National Bureau of Statistics, the updated GDP captures previously excluded activities like digital economy operations and modular refineries, amongst others. Experts commend the move, citing the pension industry's role in managing over 21 trillion naira in assets and supporting financial markets. And this inclusion enhances transparency, fosters public engagement in retirement savings, and underscores pensions' growing economic impact. Now, the last rebasing in 2014 increased the GDP by nearly 90%. So what prompted the inclusion of pension fund administration or administrators in Nigeria's rebased GDP this time? And how will this reshape our understanding of the country's financial sector's contribution to the economy? To help us give answers to these questions, I'm being joined by Wonu Kunle-Bello, who is the head of funds and investment manager ratings at Agusto Co. Thank you so much, Wonu, for joining us on the show.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so how significant is the pension industry's role in the proposed GDP rebasing plan?
Okay, I mean, you started by saying that the pension assets are 21.3 trillion. So in and of itself, the pension industry is a significant part of Nigeria's financial services sector today. If you think about it, pensions on their own, they provide the largest pool of funds, investable funds, which is used to support the traditional banking system. So when I say that, what I mean is that, pension funds, this 21 trillion is invested back into the real sector with the government. So, I mean, pension funds go ahead to support real sector growth. It goes ahead to support funding for working capital needs for operators in these sectors. I mean, to put it into a bit more context, if you think about the insurance industry within the financial services subsector, insurance assets are, under 4 trillion, by estimates. And if you look at that and you look at the contribution to GDP, it's about 0.4%. And insurance has been part of the GDP calculation for years now. So I think it's about time that we had pensions included as well as a subsector of the financial services sector. Yeah.
Okay, so how does that reflect on Nigeria's bond and investment markets? And what is actually its contribution when we're talking about economic growth?
Okay, great question. So if you look at the Nigeria's bond, debt capital markets and money markets, what you find is deficit units, that means companies in the real sector, even the government that need funding, they come here and they're looking for funds. And then you find surplus units like the PFAs, insurance companies, asset management companies, and these provide funds. So these funds, that the assets that are held by the PFAs, insurance companies, are used to fund the government, used to fund companies in the real sector. So if you look at the asset allocation of the pension assets towards in 2023, about 11% of that was allocated to the debt and money markets in Nigeria. And if you look at that, it accounted for about 85 to 90% of the entire financing needs from the debt capital market. So the pension industry is really significant in driving participation in both the debt and money markets in Nigeria. So very critical. And of course, we understand that when you fund these companies in the real sector, especially now that working capital needs are sort of increased, I mean, with FX pressures and all of that, it means that outside of the traditional banking system, pension funds, through their activities in the debt capital market, provide significant support to companies in the real sector, driving growth, real growth, what we see in the economy. So I think it's quite important in that way.
Okay, so are there any implications of including the contributory pension scheme in GDP for both employees and employers in Nigeria?
Okay, to answer this question, I'd like to reiterate that when we say the inclusion of pension fund activities in GDP, so it's not the entire 21 trillion in assets that are being managed that would then be added to GDP. So what would happen actually is that we'll then track the economic activities of the pension fund administrators. So we're going to think about, okay, so how many people, for instance, are being employed, look at the value chain. We have about, I think, 18 or thereabout PFAs currently. We have about 48 PFAs. We have custodian. We look at the value chain and the footprint of the industry and see to what degree it is, contributing to economic activity, right? So it's in that way that we're going to sort of see the implications. In terms of implications directly for employers and employees, it will be more of an indirect implication, if any. If you think about it, perhaps, including the GDP, the pension administrators in the GDP who drive conversations generally about pensions. And perhaps in driving those conversations can bring a bit more scrutiny from a regulatory perspective, maybe potentially drive compliance, So in those ways, perhaps, but I think the biggest contribution will be in terms of its ability to drive economic activities.
Now that we're seeing this somewhat drive in economic activities, will that encourage Nigerians to actively be interested in their retirement savings more now that we're seeing that they're being included in this probable GDP rebasing?
Interesting question. So the way I would look at it is, in every area of the world, in Nigeria, so if you have value, if you do provide value, people would tend to patronize you. So I think in terms of driving interest in retirement savings account, in terms of driving contributions, the focus should be on creating value and then communicating that value in a way that the intended or the target audience are able to understand. So if you think about performance, so people need to be able to understand that there's value to me saving towards my retirement so that I'm able to get livable wages independent of, my socio-cultural, how people tend to, rely on families and things like that. So if people understand that, if I'm able to save, consistently and accumulate this amount of wealth, when I do stop working, I'll be able to get livable wage that would sustain me in my period of not working. Then I think that would be value. And people need to be able to understand that value. So performance also then needs to be communicated in a way that the average Nigerian can understand. Because I'll be honest, if I didn't work in the financial services sector, it's unlikely that I would track the performance of PFAs in the way that it is in its current state. So there are no readily set benchmarks. And the information that is communicated largely in terms of fund pricing. So you have to sort of measure the movement. So it's a bit complex in the way that the performance is communicated. So, if we truly want to drive participation, of course, we need to work with the informal sector. I know that the primary regulator is doing a lot of work in that regard. I know the micro pension plan was introduced in 2019. But participation and uptake again has been, a bit slow. So in my view, I would say to drive participation, to drive interest, you would need to be able to define the value that the industry brings and be able to communicate that value as well so that people understand the importance. So I think that's our response to that.
Okay, so noted. So let's do a little bit of comparison. Let's look at how this rebasing, if it is eventually ratified, would actually differ or be similar or probably be improved as against what we saw in 2014 when the last exercise took place. We're looking at 2014 where we saw an increase in GDP to about 90%. So let's see, if there's going to be an improvement on that and what are the projected impacts on Nigeria's economic policy now, because we know that would be equally important.
Okay, so to start with the first half of the question in terms of comparing it to 2014. So when we did the last rebasing and we grew 90%, we leapfrogged and became the largest economy in Africa. Since then, we've, sort of slid back. We're, I think, fourth now behind South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. So whether, of course, naturally, you would expect that the rebasing, the inclusion of additional inclusion of additional sectors, industries, all that will drive growth. But how much growth are we talking about? So, that remains to be seen. So whether it will take us back to number one position, whether it will be 70, 60% increase, it depends on how, we'll find out soon enough, I would say. But in terms of rebasing and how it drives economic activities and how, it could influence policy, when you think about GDP and GDP rebasing, when you think about it, what you're trying to do is to capture economic activities, right? And that's why it's done, after a certain period of time. So you want to see that, okay, the economy has changed. There are certain industries that weren't included that have become a bit more strategic, maybe more important, key to driving growth. It's important to get an accurate, or at least close to accurate, picture of what is driving the economy. And in that way, you're able to manage the economy better because you're able to potentially see maybe high growth sectors, sectors that aren't growing as quickly, sectors that perhaps need some sort of targeted government intervention to grow, things like that. So in terms of allocation of resources and the general direction of government, it's a very good way to, sort of know how well the economy is faring and where to sort of target resources. So I think that would be my response to that.
Okay, so let's get a bit controversial now. What about the inclusion of illegal activities? Of course, it was in the media and in the news outlets. Are those illegal services or acts used in other climes to gauge economic activities? And, has that positively impacted the economies too?
Interesting. There's a system of national accounts. I think that's the standard. It's a UN standard, and I think it's what Nigeria is currently leaning on in terms of its inclusion of these activities within the shadow economy. So it's something that is done. It's something that, because at the end of the day, what GDP is measuring economic activity. Those shadow activities, do they contribute to the economy? Are they part of the economic activities? I think the answer is straightforward. It's yes. But having said that, if you look at the EU, for instance, I know in 2014 there was a policy that was passed to encourage the inclusion of essentially the shadow economy, particularly prostitution and maybe drug trading. And you would see in that context that one of the principal drivers of that was, I think, the Netherlands, where those activities were already legal and they were already being computed as part of their GDP. So what that meant was that, it became difficult to then compare GDP across countries where some countries include that and others didn't. So that was in that case. But in our case, while I do not disagree that some of these illegal activities do have economic significance, we should also perhaps be a bit careful in terms of the way that we communicate and we phrase this so that we're not seen to be, not just saying, we actually aren't encouraging or, rubber stamping these legal activities. And a bit more importantly, I think the big question for Nigeria will then be, how do you measure these illegal activities? So, what's the source, for instance? How do you measure it? What is acceptable, what is not, So, there are gray areas regarding measurements that I would imagine that the NBS would work through. But I think overall, from perhaps an ethical perspective, the challenge would be that we don't communicate, accepting somewhat these illegal activities.
Well, all in all, we hope that the pension industry handlers will be able to leverage on this probable inclusion to see how they can expand their coverage and boost, of course, participation, most especially in the informal sector, one of the things that you mentioned in your comments. Thank you, Wonu Kunle-Bello, Head of Funds and Investment Manager, Ratings at Agusto Co. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on the show.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Of course.